Well,
Yeah.
yes, thank you. Okay. So there's only one more class after this on Wednesday, and the lecture will be short, and we apparently will go out and talk about things. Okay. So what I like to do today is to talk about popular culture. And I'm going to use the example of export-oriented South Korean music. But the question really is, why study popular culture? And this is a very good question, because traditionally, of course, academics, humanists, and social scientists have not studied popular culture for very obvious reasons. They felt that they were ephemeral, that is to say, they did not have permanent value. They thought they were the masses, who presumably had bad and vulgar taste. And finally, that they actually said nothing of significance, either in itself or about the culture from which it came. But there's a famous German, later Israeli scholar, Gershom Scholem, who once was accused of wasting his erudition, his intelligence, on the study of Jewish mysticism. He studied the Kabbalah, which, as some of you may know, became famous because the singer Madonna became very interested in Kabbalah. But Scholem was once asked, why is it that such a great scholar would spend time studying this nonsense? And his answer, of course, was that nonsense is nonsense, but the study of nonsense is scholarship. I mean, there is a real sense in which you can actually study anything, and it is a scholarly pursuit, if done systematically and seriously. But I think there's a deeper reason, which is that in 21st century, there's a sense in which popular culture is what culture is for most people. Whereas people used to think culture was really the highest achievements of human civilization, in particular Western civilization, increasingly people do not talk about European classical music, great works of European literature, be it Virgil, Dante. Rather, people talk about movies, TV shows, pop songs, and so on. And they actually constitute the horizon of what we know and understand. And what we understand in particular provides us with greatest insight into the way we live today. Not just in terms of illuminating the structured feelings that animate wherever you go, be it Taiwan or Thailand, but the very ideas or images we have of how society works actually come very often from these very ephemeral, very vulgar sources. When we think about how family functions, we often have images, of course, from our own experience, but really largely from the TV shows you watch, the soap operas you see, the movies you see. So the image you have of, say, how fellow Taiwanese live probably come from Taiwanese popular culture production, just as much as images you have of how, say, American families might operate probably come ultimately from Hollywood movies or TV shows. But I think there's yet another reason, which is that increasingly the very domain or the horizon in which we think about what is possible in our society, not just what is important and reflective of what exists, but even really of what we can do, what is possible in our society, actually gets shaped deeply by the sort of culture production exemplified in novels, movies, and TV shows, or even pop songs. So for all these reasons and more, I come to believe that study of popular culture is actually critical for understanding the present. But let me take a step back and suggest what we should not do when we think about popular culture. One of the reasons, of course, that social theorists in particular have never paid much attention to popular culture is that it was irrelevant. Because if you conceive of the task of theory as generating really philosophical truth, really abstract universals, then there is actually no point in studying something as ephemeral and evanescent. It's like studying the bubble, right? But if you want to study how bubbles form, of course you'd be interested in the physical or chemical structure of so-called order. Similarly, if you want to understand how society functions or how society could be changed, the logic is that you wouldn't study these effects or consequences, but you would study underlying causes. But I think, and I try to say it somewhat briefly, and I don't want to go into great detail, but it's actually not a very good way to think about social life. And in fact, I would go so far as to argue it's actually not a very good way to think about almost anything. Mathematics, for example, is taken as a discipline par excellence of deductivism, these abstract universal way of thinking. But as the philosopher Emil Lakatos argued in a very, very interesting book called Proofs and Reputations, even mathematical logic actually doesn't work like that. It's always arguments, dialectical in nature, about how you assert certain assumptions about the way things work, and others disagree on how these assumptions work. So in this argumentation or computation of these assumptions, one necessarily invokes concrete examples. That is to say, you can't just argue, even in the realm of mathematics, with a series of abstractions. There's actually even a better illustration from a book by Maurice Klein, K-L-I-N-E, if you're ever interested. And he argues that when you look at something like mathematics and see how the math develops over the centuries in various cultures, he argues that whenever mathematicians are less content to argue in terms of just abstractions, just these universals, without thinking about concrete reality, that is to say, in the case of math, in terms of applications, applied math, then mathematics inevitably degenerates. That is to say, it just starts to create puzzles that do not have either inherent value in advancing our knowledge, and certainly no external reason for doing, because there's no impact on reality. The other, of course, extreme is to study everything as a concrete particular. That is to say, you could say, I'm going to study a pop music song, I'm going to study a TV show, I'm going to study a movie, and kind of examine them in its particular and concrete manifestation. However, as I argued when I discussed empiricism, that's not a way that knowledge moves forward either, because the very assumptions one makes, the categories with which one thinks, classifications one makes, necessarily leads us to think in a more abstract way. So it turns out that as enticing as it may seem to study these particular works of art, or particular individuals for that matter, they actually cannot be done in purely empiricist fashion, because you always need to appeal to theoretical ideas, concepts, and so on. So in general, as we think about social theory, it's best to think in terms of concrete universals. That the very idea of trying to do theory is actually to eliminate the present or some concrete reality you want to explain, But the concrete reality doesn't end just being a concrete particular, but something that has relevance outside a particular context. So to put, for example, if you're interested in studying Taiwanese politics, it's not enough to study just the individuals involved and think that you can induce generalizations from studying politicians or movements, but rather one always needs recourses to more abstract ideas, but these abstract ideas must come into contact with these concrete things. So the movement forward has to be in terms of concrete universes. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to argue is that the way the world is, the way social life is, and that's not just social life, it could be natural world, is that it cannot really be isolated in any way. Inevitably, there are connections that bind different peoples, groups, institutions, and we are forced to come up, though, with these analytical or theoretical categories with which to analyze these concrete connections. And in so doing, what we need to do is be able at once to see patterns, but also to eliminate singularities or concrete entities. There's a great British poet, William Blake, who began one of his poems, Auguries of Innocence, with the line, "To see a world in a grain of sand." What he was trying to argue, of course, is that it's not enough to believe in Newtonian physics and believe that you can understand nature, the natural world. The understanding and striving, studying a grain of sand may in fact tell us something about the natural world. But in a similar fashion, when C. Wright Mills argued for the sociological imagination as the intersection of biography, history, and social structure, what he was actually trying to say was that in many ways, social theory has hitherto just been about abstract categories and concepts, just theories about patterns, but it's in fact only against the concrete experience of individuals that we can either ultimately validate or refute these generalizations. And in fact, if in fact the individual, this could be you or the people you study, actually resist the received categories and ideas, that is an insight from which you should begin your investigation. So to put it more concretely, what I'm trying to suggest is time and again, social scientists, sociologists have tried to come up with theories about social life, right? Generalizations about who you are or what society is like. You might say, if you're a Marxist, how is a class society? If you're, I don't know, a certain type of sociologist, you say there are these status groups, or you might say Taiwan has these norms, but as individuals confront these generalizations, of course it turns out that you actually don't fit very well, either as bourgeoisie or working class, which was believed for a long time that everyone in Taiwan was heterosexual, and if you don't actually share that, you obviously come up against the reality which doesn't fit you very well. And rather than being something unscientific or anti-sociological, what I'm trying to argue from these predecessors, Blake, Mills, and others, is that they actually are the beginning, or they should be the beginning of social analysis and investigation. And this singularity, I think, becomes ever more so important once we give up the assumption of causal determinism, which I talked about very briefly. If in fact you begin to see that the world is very complex and quite indeterminate, that there is no goal toward which society is moving, there's no simple categories with which you can analyze the world, then in fact the singular action, creative action, whatever you may do, actually may have more impact on what the future will bring than believing in certain deterministic theory under which most political action has taken place in much of 19th and 20th century. So the most obvious would be Marxism. It provided a lens into the present. It also provided a lens into the future. But because people believed in the theory and tried to use this abstract universal to make sense of the concrete reality wherever they were, be it Russia or China or Japan, they constantly came up against serious problems. The world just didn't seem to work that way. Individuals didn't really seem to fit under these analytical categories. And furthermore, and this is the punchline, that they had to circumscribe, limit the kind of action they engaged in precisely because the science told you to act in a certain way. So, I'll talk about more about this next time, Wednesday, the final lecture, but we live in some way in a non-sociological world. Sociology doesn't work as we thought of it anymore. And if you then look back to how sociology did work, or thought it worked, it turns out, of course, that sociologists have always had trouble explaining change. Sociologists have always emphasized the fact and explanation of reproduction, why things stay the same, and they've never been very good at explaining why things change. Okay, so getting back to popular culture. For a long time, of course, people didn't have any conceptualization of culture, as I mentioned in the first and second lecture. Right? So it's not surprising that people also didn't have concept of popular culture as we think of it. Indeed, in the West, the very idea of culture arises more or less simultaneously around 1870. Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet-critic, famously wrote a book called Culture and Anarchy. I mean, it's a very interesting book, but the only point I'm going to get out of it is that he defined culture as the best that has been thought and created by human beings. So there's the conception of culture as the German word Bildung I keep on using, as something that the thoughtful individuals had created. It's the product of cultivation, what we might call civilization. So in this conceptualization of culture, you would say Chinese culture, for example, is a series of these great highlights. Confucius, Mencius, if you like Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi, so on and on. Han poetry, and the kind of things you see in libraries and museums. So that's one idea of culture, and we still, I think, use it in this way. Certainly in English, when you say someone is cultured, it means that she or he has read widely or has knowledge of art, music, and so on. 2 years later, British anthropologist, or what we would call anthropologists today, E.B. Tylor wrote a book called Primitive Culture. And essentially what he does in this book is present what today sometimes people call the anthropological definition of culture. So in this conceptualization, culture is no longer the products of a human mind, right, or human creation. Rather, culture is simply the way we live. So it could be everything from the sort of food we eat, how we cook them, the kind of houses we live in, the kind of rituals, life course events we engage in, everything that makes life slightly interesting and different become part and parcel of this anthropological definition of culture. How we treat newborn babies, how we bury people and mourn the dead, these all become under the ambit of cultural analysis. So we have on the one hand then, great works of art, that's culture, and on the other, everything, the way we live. Now, the commonality in two conceptions is, of course, that by and large, both people thought that the domain or terrain of culture was largely national. English, German, and French were different, just like Chinese, Japanese, and Korean would be different. The second commonality was that in some way, both theorists, or both philosophers, or writers, thought that this thing called culture was foundational or fundamental. So, for example, in this conceptualization, kind of an elite conceptualization, if you come and say you're really interested in Germany, for example, you really want to understand Germany, if you believe in the Arnoldian conception, as a teacher or as an expert, what I would do is give you the highlights of German culture. So I would tell you to read Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, perhaps. If you listen to, it's not really German, but kind of Germanic music, Beethoven, Wagner, whatever. And then after you've mastered German thought, Kant, Hegel, whoever, then I would then pronounce you to be a master of German culture. And this is the way many courses are taught even today. You want to know about Japan? Well, you read classical texts. You learn something about classical arts, and then you feel that you've understood Japan. Never mind that almost no one in Japan today knows anything about these things, but we think we understood Japan. The second conceptualization, of course, is very different. How do you understand? Well, since I used the example of Japan, Japan. You know, do you read the Tale of Genji and think that you really understand Japan? Well, no. You try to understand how people live, what sort of food they eat, what sort of workplaces they go to, what schools they attend, what sort of funeral practices they may have, how they rear their children, so on and on. But in either case, what is foundational for understanding is culture. And finally, in both conceptions, culture is understood as something like tradition. It's received. People before you have made it, and you just take it. And it's quite unclear in both conceptions how you change them, how you contribute to them. In many ways, it's simply assumed that you reproduce it at best. So for a long time, in Europe certainly, and even the US, people who believed in this conception actually was very much a traditionalist. Traditionalist in the sense that you felt there was really nothing new you could do, because it's been done. So the best thing is to study these classics or the greats. You're not supposed to go and try to contribute, really. You're supposed to just study them. Okay, but of course, it turns out that the Arnoldian conception is deeply problematic. Once you begin to study cultural history in this Arnoldian sense, everyone comes quickly to realize that there was never any consensus on what the best that has been thought or felt ever was. Italian opera, which now some people think is the height of sophistication, of course, emerged as a very popular genre, right? Not an elite one at all, and people look down on opera as a very vulgar form of music. Ditto in many ways for Shakespeare or Melville in the US, that what we today consider to be classics very often were dismissed as sort of popular thing. And again, in this realm, we see the constant invention of tradition. That is to say, we look for ancestors that we like, or perhaps the ancestors we deserve. And as I mentioned repeatedly, even the very notion of culture, as we think of it as national culture, was a very recent thing. For a long time, of course, there was no such thing. So getting back to Germany, for example, even today, right? There is no real such thing as German food. You know, if you go to Germany and say, I want German food, people will be very puzzled. Because it's not that Germans don't eat food, of course they do, but they just eat regional cuisine. I mean, similarly, I think in Taiwan or China, still the very idea of Chinese food is slightly foreign. Because there are so many distinct regional cuisines. You don't go to a Chinese restaurant. Of course, in the US, you go to a Chinese restaurant. Well, that's a very, very different thing. And second, of course, related is, of course, the vast gulf between elite and non-elite culture in the Sino-Odian sense was so immense. It's not really worth talking about a singular culture. And even in the anthropological conception, it's simply the fact that elites and non-elites very often live very different lives. Because after all, in a status society, it's the distinction that is foundational. So the very idea of unified culture would have made no sense to people. Finally, and this is the point of the transition to popular music, is that neither conception, it turns out, Arnoldian or Tylerian, the elite or anthropological, has anything much to do with popular culture as we think of it today. Because popular culture is largely the product of the culture industry. Culture industry that is manufactured much in the same way that people manufacture cars or stereos or cell phones, mobile phones. And in thinking about the culture industry that dominates popular culture today, again, whether you're thinking about Tanzania or Taiwan, it doesn't really matter. It's almost everywhere the same. What is truly ascendant is neither this elite Arnoldian conception or the anthropological conception, but increasingly this commodified form of cultural production, which then threatens to become popular culture, which in turn becomes culture, period. Okay, I talked over this already, but I'm going to talk about popular music because I find it very interesting, personally, but also that it's not been studied very much. And there are many reasons why. One is, of course, that it's marginal. You know, no one remembers old songs, except old people. We don't, I mean, increasingly there are books on old popular music, but by and large, most people didn't care. And ephemerality contributed to a situation in which there were no data. So for a long time, for example, you just couldn't find even recordings or videos of early television shows. It was very, very difficult to find. And if you should ever embark on these areas of inquiry, it's really shocking how these super popular movies from the 1920s and 30s that everyone who was anyone in urban Taipei or urban Tokyo watched have disappeared completely. We don't even know where they are. And they have been lost, presumably, for all eternity. And the final reason is I think that by and large, intellectuals or academics value the visual, you know, the sense of the 5 or 6 senses we have, or we talk about. The sense we value most is the visual, because we read, and that's how we learn, and very often how we think. All the other senses seem somewhat non-intellectual, non-cognitive, and seem therefore inferior. And certainly the visual has a wonderful advantage that they can become reified and preserved in texts, movies, and so on. For a long time, we had no real way to package things like sound, smell, touch. But the paradox is, I think, that at the same time, when you talk to people, individuals, and and probably true for you too, it's actually not these books or newspapers, right, that really capture the concrete individual lives or even the place at the time, but precisely these other senses. The famous French novelist, also Proust, of course, famously talked about how eating Madeline's French cookie made him remember the past and the memory and brought back everything, which became the basis of his very long novel. But even outside that realm, when you talk to people young or new, what most vividly brings back a particular sense of place and time is very often these non-visual senses. And I like to suggest very often it's music. That when an old person hears pop music from her or his youth, it readily evokes a sense of place and time. Right. Okay. I mean, as I keep on saying, the trouble with academic life is that even though this abstract universal stuff is actually not that useful at some level, we have constituted academic life so that that's all you basically learn. And of course, social theory is one of the worst because we just talk about abstract universals. And so everything that's concrete becomes kind of uninteresting, you know. So you want in a theory course to have just a list of famous names, famous theorists, from old people like Marx and Weber to very, very new people, whether you like, you know, Ulrich Beck or Niklas Luhmann or Pierre Bourdieu, it doesn't really matter. But we become this bizarre march of great ideas and great men, usually, who were actually talking about something very concrete, but we forget that they were talking about concrete things, and we just treat them as this pantheon, this great march of abstract universal ideas. But let me try to rescue it somehow and talk about Korea, because it's obviously a concrete thing. The only thing I want to say about traditional music was that, again, there was no such thing as Korean music. Why? Because on the one hand, there were great regional variation, but more importantly, because there was such a fundamental rift between elite music, the music of the landlords and the monarchy, and popular music, agrarian music, and so on. Now, what's interesting about this is that on the one hand, music was yet another way in which social distinction could take place, right? So elite could say that we are better than the masses because we valorize these Confucian principles, even in the realm of music. Confucius, if you ever read Confucius, you may remember that he actually stresses music as an important part of cultivation of a gentleman or literati, because it's a one way to teach harmony between nature, social order, and the individual. So anyway, these elites took that very seriously, and in contrast, they felt that agrarian people, peasants really, were inferior because they didn't stress harmony. Rather, their form of music seemed bestial. They were like animal ones. Right? So even today, of course, people who love European classical music in East Asia and elsewhere actually look down on popular music because they just hear it as wailings of uneducated people.
I'm sorry. I'm really sorry.
It's okay.
Did I have to turn this off?
Anyway, but of course, it turns out that there is all sorts of convergences. One of the interesting things you'll find if you study sound culture is that East Asia actually is divided into two for some reason. Essentially, there's kind of a Silk Road culture that brings music, essentially from Western Asia and ultimately from Greek islands. And what's interesting that they use the pentatonic scale, that's the scale you get from playing black keys on the piano, but also rhythms, which are usually in 3 beats. Right? So you go to anywhere from, say, Turkey to Kazakhstan to the Mongolia and Korea, you can see a continuity in some way because traditional music all have basically 3-beat structure. What's interesting about China is presumably came from the south, not from Silk Road, but kind of the dominant rhythm. I mean, they used pentatonic scale, but the dominant rhythm became 2 beats or 4 beats. And interestingly, Japan did this as well. So there's kind of a divide in these stages. But the more interesting point is that all traditional music in all East Asian societies, everywhere, basically die. And they die and become essentially part of what I call imaginary museum. Meaning that, of course, it's not completely dead in the sense that old paintings or old sculptures don't die. They're museums. And similarly, music, these traditional music actually belong to an imaginary museum from which people occasionally want to experience the exotic and the old and play these traditional music wherever you go. But in reality, what happens in East Asia is that everywhere, including communist China, they each begin to embrace European classical music. And this becomes a critical form of cultural capital. This is how you show that you are better than the rest of the people. And not just that, but that you also belong to modernity in some way. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why this happens, right? But the fundamental point is that East Asians, Japanese certainly, and because of Japan, people in colonial Korea and Taiwan, but also people in China, especially even after 1949, because of Soviet influence, just everywhere associates European classical music with elite music. What's interesting is that also everywhere there arises actually popular music that's distinct from folk music or agrarian music. Agrarian music survived everywhere, wherever they were present. But certainly in Japan, this had disappeared pretty much by 1960s. In South Korea, this was very basically gone by 1980s. And in China, it's still alive in very, very rural places, but increasingly it's disappearing as well. What takes over, though, is not the traditional elite music, or the European classical music, or agrarian music, but rather westernized form of popular music. And I say westernized because it's really basically borrowing full scale from American and European popular music and adapting it with East Asian lyrics. So if you're in China, you would speak in Chinese, Korean in Korea, but fundamentally music is the same. I'm going to play a clip of the sort of music that dominated in South Korea. It's different in some way from other nation states, but I'll show you why. So this is a woman named Lee Mi-ja, who was kind of a queen of South Korean popular music. Whenever I catch taxi, I notice that people are listening to this kind of music. But the point is that it's actually a genre of music that was developed in Japan called ENFA. And essentially, people in neighboring countries actually adopted this. Right? How do we know we adopted this? Well, historically, you can show that they had these adoptions, and you can kind of see musically how they're very similar and so on. What's interesting, though, is that people, wherever you go, think that this is actually traditional music, that it's speaking to the soul of Japanese or Koreans or Chinese, it doesn't really matter. But in fact, of course, the music actually isn't traditional at all. It's actually based on European choral music. Right? Of course, they use national lyrics. But in almost every element, it just deviates fundamentally from Gregorian music on the one hand and elite music on the other. But more importantly, one of the reasons that people begin to think that this Japanese/East Asian form of popular music is traditional music, that is to say traditional cultural music, is of course the influence of the US, which becomes completely dominant, increasingly dominant, I should say. In the case of Korea, it begins to arrive after 1945 because US becomes the dominant power. Right? So there are all these US soldiers who come, live in camp towns, and essentially want to listen to their kind of music. And over time, people everywhere begin to want to imitate because it's seen as the music of advanced people. I don't know why I like this clip, but I'll show it to you. Stop. Well, so much for that. It's actually Western pop music, and what's interesting, actually, I'm sorry I can show it, is that it's a youngish woman who dances around while she's singing. So she's like dancing while she's singing. And this is in 1970 or so. But what's interesting is that when the Korean CIA, the national security apparatus of the CIA, in South Korea, saw this singer dancing like this, they became convinced. I mean, it's hard to believe, but the Cold War, as I keep on telling you, generated very, very bizarre thoughts. So the KCIA began to think that she must be doing something wrong, something bad. And the main thing that they decided was that she must be sending a special message to North Korea. So they had this huge file on her trying to decode what this thing was. That's just it. Anyway, but the point I wanted to make from that is not just that KCIA and the Cold War created strange ideas about things, but that it seemed very strange to people, right? The American music just seems strange. And this is because it turns out that the music, or the sound genre, is actually one of the most conservative, along with the taste buds. Right? So one of the last things to change in any culture, I think, is the food you eat. Because you essentially form what you like or used to at a very young age, essentially by your 20s. I mean, they are adventurous eaters, of course, but basically, to the extent they have studied these things, if you haven't eaten something by your 20s, you've not tried it. So in the West, for example, there is a very simple dividing line between people who eat sushi, right, and people who refuse to eat sushi. And it's simply just exposure. And we can kind of see this down the line. But in any case, music is not as conservative as taste buds, but it comes very close. Because by and large, people actually don't want to listen to the kind of music they didn't listen to, usually by their 20s. They just don't listen to it. So in the US, for example, there's a very simple dividing line. I know almost exactly how old someone is if she or he claims to like hip-hop. Or if someone says, hip-hop is not music, right? And that kind of divide is really just a testament to conservatism that you too will develop as you age. Okay. But what's interesting about East Asia to me is the other element which I tried to emphasize in the last two lectures, although I passed it by very quickly, which is the power of authoritarian state. I mean, of course, every polity has strong states of some sort which try to intervene in many aspects of life. But East Asian states, in particular, were very good about trying to intervene in cultural spheres. So, like Taiwan, actually, and like Japan before World War II, and like China pretty much throughout communist rule, there was a strong culture of censorship. And what's interesting is that in the South Korean case, the culture of censorship basically targeted everyone. So that music you heard by Lee Mija, this queen of trot or enka music, she was actually banned by the military government. And you all want to know why the government, this was the military dictatorship in the 60s. You know why Park Chung-hee, the military dictator, would ban the music you heard?
Because it's influenced by income?
Yes, very good. Excellent. Yes, because she was obviously pro-Japanese. So she's not good. So the government was very pro-American. Did they like American music? No. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Terrible. And they may be sending signals to North Korea. So they essentially, what they began to do is try to create their own pop music, or healthy pop music, which I'm not going to make you listen to, because it's kind of painful. But what's kind of interesting is that, so you create, everywhere, this very bizarre popular music culture in which many things are just banned. So if you go to North Korea today, rock music is banned. Why? Well, it's decadent Western music. Well, in theory, Japanese music is also banned. Why? Because it's decadent, imperialist music. For a long time in mainland China, all sorts of music was similarly banned for similar reasons. Okay. So if you look at then South Korea in 1988, a long time ago, of course, there was something like national popular culture as it developed everywhere in East Asia. Japanese people believed that they had Japanese national music, popular music. Chinese believed the same. Taiwanese to a large extent believed the same, so on and on. But it's also a time when things were changing, right? Because they were trying to shed colonial influence from Japan and trying to embrace American influence. So if then I go to K-pop, well, the point I'm trying to stress is that there's a huge jump. So you have a culture in which basically pop music is strictly censored and controlled. So you can possibly export them because there's no basis for developing. And yet, in a matter of 25 years, actually in a matter of 20 years, South Korean music industry manages to be able to develop and export music industry, pop music industry. How is this possible? Well, it's true, it was possible for several reasons. One is that South Korea was rapidly Americanized, especially in musical taste. And here the vanguard was young people who simply just stopped listening to older Korean/Japanese music and only listened to essentially American music, grew up with American music from birth. So for them, traditional Korean music is very foreign, as is older popular music. And just as importantly, Korean culture changes quite rapidly, so that non-musical aspect of pop music also become very normative, meaning that everything from the way people dress, the way people gesticulate, the way they express emotions, they come to approach kind of the American Western norm. At the same time, basically, the music industry cultivates both artists and audience. So the European Western soundscape become normative. There is a group called teenagers who also become dominant. And at the same time, people begin to be less and less serious. That is to say, less confusion. If you ever have time and want to do a simple project, you could always get old photos and see how people pose and try to figure out when people began to smile. Because everywhere in East Asia, this was true in Europe and America too, to have portrait taken was a very serious moment, and to be serious, you have not to smile. Also, obviously something frivolous person would do. But as I saw today in graduation picture, everyone smiles. And this originally was not done not so long ago. John, did you smile in your graduation picture? Oh, okay, you're young, I forgot. Sorry. Okay, so everything begins to change. People become enriched. There's democracy. People grow up watching television. People grow up singing, karaoke machine. And so, by the time this group, Soteji and the Boys, arrived, South Korean music scene was actually in a point of radical transformation. I actually love this video, so I'm going to show it to you. So this is 1992, and essentially most people were listening to the kind of music I played earlier. Most older people, very old, slow, enka-like songs. And all of a sudden, this group shows up and appears on this national television show. Doesn't work. Okay. I'm going to tell you without doing the imitation.
We can try.
Check.
Yeah,
No, it's okay. So, I'll show you other things later. So it's a group of boys who introduces hip hop, essentially. That's what you do them. And it starts dancing. That's break dancing. Okay? And it's a show that has all these commentators at the end who talks about how good they were. And essentially each judge said, this is just terrible. Why don't you stop dancing and just stand still? So another judge basically says, why don't you learn how to sing? Why are you talking when you're singing? And so on and on. So they're completely baffled, and the group got the worst score ever. But of course, the group then became astonishingly popular. It sold 1.7 million copies. This is when South Korea had a population of 40 million. So it just became astonishing hit. And what they did was, of course, to break all the rules that dominated South Korea. You're supposed to stand still, but they became like Michael Jackson. They started dancing. You're supposed to sing in this nice, slow, mellifluous way, like ballad singers. But no, they started doing this hip-hop thing. And so over time, everything begins to change very, very rapidly. And most importantly, all the kind of cultural prescriptions, taboos on how you could be changes almost overnight. And I'm going to show you two videos. So this is at the beginning stage of what you might call K-pop. And it's a girl group called Pinkle. It's Pinkle, but anyway, Korean it's Pinkle. It's not working. Okay, this is not that interesting. But I just want you to notice how they're dressed. Okay? Just notice how they're dressed. Okay, so what happens? So what happens 2 years later? This is just 2 years later.
希望会再亮眼，但难免闷热。
Okay, I mean, this is not really shocking for you because you're young, but basically what happens is overnight, in a matter of 2 years, you go from the norm being everyone being completely covered. Right? I mean, the norm was you covered yourself if you're a woman. You couldn't even really show your legs very much. So you could have been in, you know, Saudi Arabia. Just put a little bit of a hat and you'll be fine. But 2 years later, they're showing, you know, their midriff, their legs, their shoulders. They dye their hair. No one dyed their hair until then. And I'm, I mean, you know, in Taiwan, I guess you're probably young, I mean, old enough probably to remember the most, I mean, maybe you weren't paying attention. But, you know, one day, everyone has black hair. And 2 years later, everyone begins to dye their hair. And so, what happens is that the very way in which people think, what they think is proper, right? What is possible to be, say, in this case, Korean or Japanese or Chinese, changes overnight. And so, in 2003, when this video came out, journalists very often talk about Lee Hyori syndrome. Lee Hyori is the woman who was the second video. She was actually in the first video too. But she changes, dyes her hair, shows her body. And for the Korean men, apparently, I wasn't there, but couldn't concentrate because they were so mesmerized by seeing a female body twisting in this sexist way. Anyway. So that's basically what has to happen to have something like K-pop, right? It's basically Americanized popular music, which partakes of, becomes really essentially part of Americanized present. And what happens is from the late 1990s, there's a constant effort to try to export this. And the question then becomes, how is it possible? Well, as I keep on saying, it has nothing to do with Korea. It has nothing to do with tradition. It has nothing to do with folk culture. It has everything to do with business. It has everything to do with culture industry. And so if you try to understand why they wanted to export this so much, well, one reason, of course, is that South Korea had a relatively small market in popular music. So if you take a figure from 2000, it's all in US dollars, right? US popular music industry is 16 billion, Japan is 6. South Korea is only 300. Taiwan's small, 2044, but PRC is even smaller back then. And there's money in popular music. But at the same time, Korea experiences the Asian fiscal or currency crisis. And there's a great demand to try to export because people are not buying things within the country. And this is accentuated by a series of changes. Right? Not only that there were low prices, but copyright protection was not very strictly enforced. And it was one thing when you were trying to sell records, I mean, they made pirates, but it's still relatively costly to produce pirated cassettes or LPs, or CDs even. But with the introduction of MP3 players, free downloads become possible. So piracy becomes even more serious. So the solution essentially the industry came up with was to export. Export this thing called popular music. And so what they do is they try first to export to Japan. And what's interesting to me, again, is that initially they tried to export this as Japanese popular music. So this is the first K-pop person who made #1 in Japan.
さあ、それでは、モアさんに来ていただきました。
結構言われる。
それどうですか、気持ち。
どうかな。
よりも上に見られる。
ある意味ではすごく好きなんだけど、どうでしょうね。ちょっと恥ずかしいことでもなるかもしれ
I
ない。
don't know if you know that much
そう
Japanese,
ですよね。
but
これもある。
はい。
what's remarkable is, of course, that I mean, Korean and Japanese are actually very similar grammatically.
私はちなみにそんなに
I mean, it's language, but phonetically, it's very different. So it's almost impossible
全
to
部
be
全然できな
fluent
いですよ、私は。自
in
分で
both Korean and Japanese. Most people can tell readily
やらないんだ。
whether or not you're
一
Korean
回
or
マスカラ
Japanese.
やったことがありますけど。
But Boa is speaking Japanese. She's 13,
そうそうそうそう。
and she's speaking Japanese
こと
fluent.
あるから。
And the reason, of course, is that that was kind of the export strategy at the time. You want, effectively, to export, say, Koreans, but pretend essentially that they're Japanese, so the Japanese fan would identify with this person as Japanese. And this formula becomes even more of a big hit with Toho Shinki, or it's known in Chinese language areas as either DBST or TV2X. And again, they do the same thing. They start singing in Japanese, acting like J-pop fans. But what's interesting is that the market changes, right? That for a market that long looked down on Koreans because Japanese have colonized Korea, so on and on, 2002 marks a big break when Japanese begin to consume South Korean cultural products, most famously the Winter Sonata, the soap opera that becomes kind of a national sensation and obsession. So thereafter, then, there's this effort to generalize this export strategy. And what makes export music possible is a whole series of changes that happens roughly around this time. So first, there is the end of post-war, or global Cold War era, and the beginning of the denationalization of popular culture. Even more importantly, everywhere there begins to be kind of a cultural convergence. That is the kind of a global pop noise. By which I mean, I don't mean just like the kind of music you listen to or dance to, but background sentiments that animate American pop music. So for example, it's impossible to really understand American pop music without understanding romantic love. It's basically mostly about your first love or unrequited love or breakup or whatever. Okay. And though this may seem really obvious, but of course romantic love is a very odd concept that emerges sometime in 18th century Europe. I mean, it's always existed something like romantic love, but it takes kind of a systematic form and becomes kind of a dominant conceptualization of what love is, so that everything becomes, everything begins to move around the fulcrum of something called romantic love. And though this actually may seem obvious to you because you're young, there are generations for whom this is very strange. So imagine a situation, as was the case in South Korea, where in the 1980s, you know, the majority of marriages were still largely arranged by parents. So you really don't want romantic love that much if you are going to be attachment. But again, this completely changes so that even in mainland China, so if you went to mainland China in 1979 or so, so as I did, you know, a lot of people weren't that interested in romantic love. It didn't come up. Now, young mainland Chinese seem to, urban ones at least, can't stop talking about it. East Asia, of course, becomes increasingly affluent and begin to develop a series of sensibilities which are quite common. And there's also all sorts of technological change, the internet revolution, social media revolution, which made dissemination of music and videos very easy. But there are other reasons, right, that go on. One is, of course, that the talent pool emerges, meaning that popular music becomes really a dominant genre. That is to say, people begin to lead lives such that they spend all their time listening to music, MP3 players, and singing in karaoke places. And this was made possible precisely with the decline of, for lack of better words, I call Confucian culture. Under Confucian cultural norms, you're supposed to study hard. You don't want to be an entertainer because that's for low status people. You don't show off your body. You're supposed to be restrained. And you certainly don't want to engage in frivolous thing like chase pop stars or be one. All this changes. So, for example, in South Korea, if you see surveys of young people, a survey of children, girls actually, so it may not be perfect, but girls, I think 14 to 18. If you ask them in early 1990s what they would like to be when they grew up, these are high school students. Number one occupation was teacher. Okay. And music star, pop singer, was not in top 30. They only list top 30, so I don't really know the percentage. 10 years later, or 15 years later, number one becomes K-pop star. Professor used to be really high. No, it's not even in top 10. In the latest one, it wasn't even in top 30. Why is that? Does that mean that professors are like rock stars 30 years ago? Sorry. They're not anymore. Right? Well, anyway, and essentially, so you have this wide pool and amazing competition. And what's interesting is, of course, that they are not just made, right? They have to be made. And these K-pop stars you might see, what's interesting is that they are trained. They're trained for usually about 5 years, if not 10 years. And they have to audition, and if they make the audition, they get trained, and of the people who are trained, maybe 5 to 10% get to be professionals. And what's even more interesting is, of course, these agencies that produce K-pop stars invest enormous amount of money, right? Including things like plastic surgery, so they look better. And this is one kind of typical training schedule, meaning that they just do this all day long, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, 51 weeks a year. So no wonder they become very good. Right. They become good at singing and dancing. And they learn all sorts of tricks that, in particular, African American singers are very good at. So, for example, in East Asia, basically most songs you learn when you're growing up are in 4 beats. They're slow. If you like rock music, you might begin to sing in 8 beats. But these K-pop music are in 16 beats. They're very fast, and it doesn't come naturally to most East Asians. But more importantly, East Asian music, like most music, starts with the downbeat, right? It's the first beat that gets the accent. That's just the natural way people sing. But and this African American inflected popular music stresses the backbeat, the second beat. And though this may seem easy, if you try it, you'll find that it's actually very difficult. But what's interesting about K-pop stars is that they can do it, because they've been training for 5 years. And just as importantly, I think, and this is a part that really interests me, is that the whole conception of beauty changes. And it's changing in East Asia. Of course, this is partially nutritional or environmental, right? I mean, that is that people get richer, they eat more protein, they get bigger. So in the Korean case, just in 30 years, average height grew by 9 centimeters. And it's actually even more. So if you compare North Koreans and South Koreans, the stereotype, we don't have statistics, but the stereotype was, of course, that North Koreans are taller because as you go north in Korean Peninsula, people get taller. It's slightly true in mainland China too. Northern Chinese tend to be taller than Southern Chinese. But now the height difference between North Korean 17-year-old and South Korean 17-year-old is something like 16 centimeters. Meaning that they're just different races of people. But it's more than that. A lot of it is done through surgical knife. Right? And the look that Korean wave or K-pop tries to cultivate is not really Western. I mean, they're not trying to look Western, but it's Western inflected. So historically, in East Asian agrarian societies, kind of the look that was really popular tended to be stocky body with round face. You know, it's good to be slightly chubby because it shows that you're wealthy. But increasingly, everyone becomes chiseled and sculpted, both in face and body. And so over time, we essentially begin to create what I think of sometimes as kind of this global Asian look. So I'll just show you what I mean. Oh. Never mind. You can look at it yourself. But and the reason I say global Asian look is that particular sculpted look become quite popular. It's interesting, it's not that popular in Taiwan yet, but it's very popular in Japan. And if you go to China, coastal cities, it's also becoming very, very popular. Okay, but that's all good and well, but what then happens? Why does it work? Well, I think it works for a number of reasons, as I mentioned. One is, of course, that there is kind of global convergence of norms. Right? There is kind of a standard way in which pop music can narrate things, use symbols, and draw on conventions. Furthermore, as I mentioned, there's enrichment in the rise of leisure societies. And that is to say, teenagers everywhere begin to act on it. They have money, disposable income, they have relative freedom from parents, and they can buy what they want to buy. And most importantly, South Koreans in particular become very good at making things called pop music, just like they became very good at making cars or cell phones. And the way I would usually describe or explain it is that it's actually hard to make bad movies. We make fun of B movies, but it's actually even hard to make B movies because you actually need a great deal of expertise and know-how. Right? But essentially, you achieve enough convergence of skills and techniques so that you are able to create them. I'm going to skip this. So what happens then is that the culture industry becomes kind of a dominant way in which culture is consumed everywhere, so that it really has nothing to do with, as I keep on saying, what happened before. So as I say, it has nothing to do with elite culture, has nothing to do with folk culture, this agrarian tradition, and it doesn't actually have anything to do with what went on before, at the time of national popular culture. Right? Kind of the Enka-type songs that were popular everywhere. So increasingly what dominates is this Americanized pop music. It doesn't have to be pop music. I could have been talking about movies. Right? That is a similar thing happens to movies. It's obviously not elite traditional or popular traditional. It's obviously a Western medium, but in many places with Western import, Japanese influence, each national culture begins to build something like national style. But these also get overtaken such that there's kind of this new norm of quasi-Hollywood movie making. And I'm suggesting the same for popular music. So there's this quasi-American popular music. The only difference being that the faces you see aren't Americans or white or black, but increasingly Asians. So however you study it, in terms of musical composition, in terms of lyrics, kind of the ideas behind them, kind of movements people make, what they wear, even the face or the body, they all change. So much so that there is no connection to the past. And furthermore, because they are business products that are meant to be exported, what happens is that they partake these curiously pan-Asian or even universal veneer. And this is done in any number of ways. The look, it's done in terms of language. So the girls' generation I mentioned in the lecture I gave, the sociology department, there are 9 women, but 2 of them speak English fluently, 2 of them speak Mandarin fluently, 2 of them speak Japanese fluently. And this is not an accident. It's a conscious strategy to try to appeal to these different markets. So essentially what happens is, yes, you can create something called K-pop that's called Korean, but in the process, it actually has nothing to do with Korean, except as a product of Korean business. And though I just talked about one popular culture genre, I think it's very symptomatic of the trends that dominate, I think, not just in East Asia, but around the world. Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break and come back at 8.
Good.